The Aether Chronicles, My Journey into the Primordial Field. By Robert X. Bishop. The Intuition. It happened in my laboratory in Winchester, Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon. In March of 2016. Unremarkable in every way except one. I knew, with a certainty that transcended data and bypassed reason entirely, that the ether was real. Not simply the reality of ether, but an anomaly which could allow information to be transmitted from the present into the past. I was calibrating instruments for yet another series of longitudinal electromagnetic wave experiments, work that had occupied me, on and off, for nearly 3 decades. The oscilloscope traced its familiar patterns across the screen. My notes lay scattered across the bench, filled with observations that refused to align with conventional electromagnetic theory. And then, in that peculiar stillness that sometimes descends in laboratories late in the day, something shifted. It wasn't a thought exactly, more like a recognition. The kind of knowing that arrives fully formed, as if it had always been there, waiting for consciousness to catch up. The medium I had been seeking, the substrate that could explain the anomalies I'd observed, the longitudinal waves that shouldn't exist according to Maxwell's equations, the strange action-at-a-distance effects that haunted my experiments, it was all around me. It always had been. We had simply stopped looking for it. My friend, Sir Arthur C. Clarke, once wrote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I would add a corollary: any sufficiently fundamental truth, once forgotten by humanity, becomes indistinguishable from a fantasy. The ether had suffered precisely this fate. Dismissed, discarded, relegated to the dustbin of scientific history alongside phlogiston and the geocentric universe. Yet here I stood, surrounded by instruments that whispered of its presence if only one knew how to listen. That moment of intuition launched what would become a decades-long investigation, one that would lead me through ancient philosophy, Tesla's radical visions, Cold War weapons research, and ultimately to a speculative understanding of consciousness itself. This is the story of that journey, and of the primordial reality that may connect all things. The lost quintessence. To understand what we abandoned, we must first understand what the ether once meant to human thought. The ancient Greeks called it the quintessence, the fifth element, beyond earth, air, fire, and water. Aristotle conceived of it as the substance of the celestial spheres, eternal and unchanging, the material from which the heavens themselves were woven. Unlike the 4 terrestrial elements which were subject to generation and corruption, the ether was incorruptible, moving in perfect circles, sustaining the cosmic order. This was not mere poetic fancy. The Greeks were attempting to solve a genuine problem: how do celestial bodies move through space? What medium carries light from the stars to our eyes? Their answer, a subtle, all-pervading substance, was both elegant and empirically motivated. The ether explained observation. It provided mechanism. It unified the cosmos. Through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, the concept evolved but never disappeared. Alchemists spoke of the quintessence as the spirit within matter, the animating principle that connected the physical and the divine. Natural philosophers debated its properties. Was it fluid or crystalline? Did it rotate with the heavens or remain stationary? These were serious scientific questions, pursued with the full rigor of their age. By the 19th century, the luminiferous ether had become central to physics. Light was understood as a wave, and waves require a medium. The ether was that medium, an invisible elastic substance filling all of space, through which electromagnetic waves propagated. Maxwell's equations described electromagnetic phenomena with stunning precision, and the ether provided the stage on which this electromagnetic drama unfolded. Scientists measured its properties. They calculated its density and elasticity. They designed experiments to detect Earth's motion through it. The ether was as real to Victorian physicists as atoms or energy. It was the foundation upon which the edifice of physics rested. And then came the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887. Albert Michelson and Edward Morley set out to measure Earth's velocity through the ether by comparing the speed of light in perpendicular directions. If Earth moved through a stationary ether, light should travel at different speeds depending on whether it moved with or against the ether wind. The experiment was ingenious, the apparatus exquisitely sensitive. The result, null, no difference, no ether wind. The experiment was repeated, refined, repeated again, always the same result. The scientific community faced a crisis. Either the ether dragged along with Earth, which created its own problems, or something more fundamental was wrong with our understanding of space and time. Einstein's special relativity, published in 1905, resolved the crisis by eliminating the need for ether entirely. Space and time were not absolute. They were relative, interwoven into a four-dimensional spacetime. Light required no medium. It simply propagated through the geometry of spacetime itself. The ether became superfluous, an unnecessary hypothesis. Physics moved on. The ether was forgotten, mentioned only in historical footnotes as an example of how even brilliant scientists can be wrong. An entire conceptual framework, millennia of thought about universal connection and cosmic medium, was swept away in a single paradigm shift. But was it disproven or merely abandoned? This question would haunt me for decades. The road not taken. Nikola Tesla never accepted the ether's dismissal. While Einstein's relativity captured the imagination of the physics establishment, Tesla continued his work on what he called radiant energy, a form of electromagnetic transmission that he believed operated through the ether medium. In Tesla's view, the ether was not a passive backdrop, but a dynamic, fluid-like substance that could be manipulated, compressed, and made to carry energy across vast distances. Tesla's vision was radical. He proposed that all forces, electromagnetic, gravitational, even the subtle forces of life and consciousness, operated through the ether. Gravity itself, he suggested, was not an inherent property of mass but a secondary effect produced by matter's interaction with the ether field. Electromagnetic waves were not disturbances in spacetime, but actual vibrations in the ether field. His experiments with high-frequency alternating currents and wireless energy transmission were attempts to harness this medium directly. The famous demonstrations at Colorado Springs, where he lit lamps wirelessly and generated artificial lightning, were not merely engineering achievements but proofs of concept for an ether-based physics. History records that Tesla's approach was superseded by Einstein's. But let us engage in a thought experiment. What if it had been the other way around? Imagine an alternate 20th century where Tesla's ether physics, rather than Einstein's relativity, became the dominant paradigm. Where would we be today? In this alternate timeline, the physics of the 1920s and 30s focuses not on quantum mechanics and particle physics, but on understanding the properties and dynamics of the ether field. Scientists develop sophisticated mathematical descriptions of ether flow, compression, and resonance. The ether becomes as precisely characterized as electromagnetic fields are in our timeline. By the 1950s, engineers have learned to manipulate the ether directly. Wireless power transmission, Tesla's dream, becomes commonplace. Cities are powered by ether resonance stations that draw energy from the ambient field and transmit it to receivers in homes and factories. No power lines, no combustion, no nuclear reactors. Energy becomes nearly free, limited only by the capacity of transmission equipment. Gravity control follows. If gravity is an ether phenomenon, then manipulating the ether field allows manipulation of gravitational effects. By the 1970s, anti-gravity vehicles are in development. By the 1990s, they're commercial. Space travel is revolutionized, not by chemical rockets, but by craft that create localized ether distortions, effectively surfing on controlled gravitational waves much like my Bishop M thruster. Communication technology takes a different path. Instead of electromagnetic radio waves, communication systems use longitudinal ether waves, compression waves in the medium itself, analogous to sound waves in air, but propagating through the universal substrate. These waves, not being limited by the speed of light in the same way transverse electromagnetic waves are, enable near-instantaneous communication across vast distances. By 2000, humanity has established colonies on Mars with real-time communication to Earth. The understanding of consciousness evolves differently as well. If the ether is the medium through which all forces operate, then perhaps consciousness itself is an ether phenomenon, a particular pattern of resonance in the field. Research into telepathy, precognition, and other paranormal phenomena is mainstream, pursued with the same rigor as particle physics in our timeline. By 2024, consciousness studies and ether physics are deeply integrated, revealing the mechanisms by which mind interfaces with matter. This alternate world faces different challenges, of course. Ether pollution, disruptions to the field caused by industrial manipulation, becomes an environmental concern. Ether weapons, capable of creating devastating field distortions, drive new arms races. But the fundamental trajectory is one of abundance rather than scarcity, connection rather than isolation, unity rather than fragmentation. Is this fantasy? Perhaps. But it illustrates what was lost when we abandoned the ether concept. Not merely a theoretical framework, but an entire approach to understanding reality, one that emphasized connection, medium, and the fundamental unity of all phenomena. Tesla died in 1943, largely forgotten, his papers seized by government agencies. His vision of ether-based technology died with him. Or so it seemed. Decades of anomalies. My own journey into ether physics began not with theory, but with stubborn experimental facts that refused to behave. It was the early 1990s. I was investigating longitudinal electromagnetic waves, compression waves in the electric field itself, as opposed to the transverse waves described by standard electromagnetic theory. According to Maxwell's equations, such waves shouldn't exist in free space. Yet there they were, reproducible and measurable in my laboratory. The effects were subtle but unmistakable. When I generated these longitudinal waves using specially configured Tesla coils and capacitor arrays, instruments detected field variations that propagated differently than conventional electromagnetic radiation. The waves seemed to penetrate Faraday cages that should have blocked them. They produced biological effects at power levels far too low to cause thermal heating. They exhibited properties that suggested they were interacting with something beyond the electromagnetic field as conventionally understood. I published papers, I presented at conferences. The response was polite skepticism at best, dismissal at worst. Measurement artifacts, colleagues suggested, insufficient shielding, misinterpretation of near-field effects. The explanations were always plausible enough to maintain the status quo, never quite accounting for all the observations. But I kept experimenting. Over the years, the anomalies accumulated. Longitudinal waves that propagated through materials that should have blocked them. Action at a distance effects that occurred faster than light-speed communication should allow. Biological responses, changes in cellular behavior, alterations in neural activity that had no explanation in conventional biophysics. The most disturbing effects were neurological. Test subjects exposed to certain configurations of longitudinal waves reported unusual sensations. Pressure in the head, auditory phenomena, disruptions in spatial perception. These were not thermal effects. The power levels were far too low. Something else was happening, something that conventional electromagnetic theory couldn't explain. I began to wonder, what if these waves were interacting not just with matter, but with a medium, an ether field that conventional physics had declared non-existent? The breakthrough came in an unexpected way, through an investigation that had nothing to do with my laboratory work. In 2016, American diplomats in Havana began reporting strange symptoms: headaches, nausea, cognitive difficulties, hearing loss. The mysterious ailment, dubbed Havana syndrome, spread to other diplomatic posts. Intelligence agencies scrambled to understand what was happening. Was it a weapon, a surveillance technology gone wrong, mass psychogenic illness? I was consulted as part of a broader effort to investigate possible electromagnetic causes. Could directed energy weapons produce these symptoms? What mechanisms might be involved? That's when I discovered the Soviet papers. Buried in declassified archives and obscure Russian journals from the 1960s through the 1980s were dozens of studies on what Soviet researchers called non-thermal electromagnetic effects. The papers described research into longitudinal electromagnetic waves, ether field interactions, and psychophysical impacts of electromagnetic radiation. The Soviets, it seemed, had never fully abandoned ether theory. They had continued investigating it, particularly in the context of weapons development and biological effects. I remember the moment I found the first paper. It was late evening, and I was working through a stack of translated documents in my office. The paper, authored by a team at a Soviet military research institute in 1972, described experiments with longitudinal electromagnetic waves and their effects on neural tissue. The theoretical framework explicitly invoked ether field interactions to explain observed phenomena that couldn't be accounted for by conventional electromagnetic theory. My hands trembled as I read. Here, in dry technical Russian translated into equally dry English, was validation of decades of my own observations. The Soviets had seen the same anomalies. They had developed similar theoretical frameworks, and they had weaponized it. More papers followed, studies on ether resonance frequencies and their biological effects, theoretical models of consciousness as an ether field phenomenon, technical specifications for devices designed to generate longitudinal waves for psychophysical influence at a distance. The research was extensive, sophisticated, and deeply troubling. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets had developed ether-based electromagnetic weapons, then Havana syndrome might not be a mystery at all. It might be the result of precisely targeted longitudinal wave exposure, waves that interacted with the ether field in ways that produced neurological effects without the thermal signatures of conventional directed energy weapons. I wrote reports, I briefed intelligence officials, I proposed countermeasures based on ether field theory. The response was mixed, interest tempered by skepticism about the theoretical framework. Ether physics remained, for most of the scientific establishment, a discredited relic. But for me, the Soviet papers were vindication. For decades, I had observed phenomena that suggested the existence of a medium beyond conventional spacetime. Now I had evidence that others, working independently under very different circumstances, had reached similar conclusions. The ether was real, and we had abandoned it at our peril. The bridge between worlds. If the ether exists, if there is indeed a primordial field permeating all of space, then the most profound implications may lie not in physics or engineering, but in consciousness itself. Consider the hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from objective matter? How do electrochemical signals in neurons become the felt quality of redness, the taste of coffee, the sense of self? Materialist neuroscience has made tremendous progress in mapping neural correlates of consciousness, yet the explanatory gap remains. We can describe what happens in the brain when someone sees red, but not why it feels like something. What if consciousness is not generated by the brain but interfaced through it? In this view, the brain is not a consciousness-producing machine, but a transceiver, a biological antenna that couples individual awareness to a universal field of consciousness carried by the ether. Neural activity creates patterns of electromagnetic oscillation, including longitudinal waves, that resonate with the ether field. Consciousness arises at the interface between neural dynamics and ether field dynamics. This is not mysticism, but a testable hypothesis. If consciousness involves ether field interactions, then we should observe phenomena that conventional neuroscience cannot explain. First, non-local correlations in brain activity. If two brains are resonating with the same ether field patterns, they should show correlated activity even in the absence of conventional communication. This might explain documented cases of telepathy, particularly between emotionally bonded individuals. The correlation is not occurring through electromagnetic signals traveling through space, but through shared resonance in the underlying ether field. Second, precognitive phenomena. If the ether field carries information about future states, if causality in the ether operates differently than in conventional spacetime, then consciousness coupled to the ether might access information about events that haven't yet occurred in linear time. This could explain the statistically significant results in precognition experiments that have been replicated across decades of parapsychology research. Third, the effectiveness of intention and attention in influencing physical systems. If consciousness can modulate ether field patterns, and if those patterns influence matter, then focused intention should produce measurable physical effects. This might explain the small but statistically significant results in psychokinesis experiments, as well as the observer effects in quantum mechanics that have puzzled physicists for a century. The Havana syndrome cases provide a darker illustration of the consciousness-ether connection. If longitudinal electromagnetic waves can interact with the ether field in ways that affect neural function, then directed exposure could produce the observed symptoms: disrupted cognition, altered perception, neurological damage. The weapon is not heating tissue or directly disrupting neural electrical activity. It's creating distortions in the ether field that the brain, as an ether transceiver, experiences as neurological disruption. Let me propose a specific mechanism. The brain operates through synchronized oscillations across neural networks, gamma waves, theta rhythms, and other frequency bands that coordinate activity across different regions. These oscillations create electromagnetic fields, including longitudinal components. These fields couple to the ether, creating resonance patterns that constitute the substrate of conscious experience. When external longitudinal waves are introduced, particularly at frequencies that match natural brain rhythms, they create interference patterns in the ether field. The brain, attempting to maintain its normal resonance patterns, experiences this as disruption. Depending on the frequency, intensity, and duration of exposure, the effects range from mild discomfort to severe neurological symptoms. This explains why Havana syndrome victims report such varied symptoms and why conventional electromagnetic measurements often fail to detect the source. The weapon operates through ether field interactions that don't produce strong conventional electromagnetic signatures. It's analogous to the difference between shaking a rope, transverse wave, and compressing a spring, longitudinal wave, different modes of energy transmission through a medium. But if ether consciousness coupling can be weaponized, it can also be harnessed for beneficial purposes. Imagine technologies that enhance cognitive function by optimizing ether field resonance. Meditation and contemplative practices might work precisely by training the brain to achieve coherent ether field coupling. The reported benefits: enhanced awareness, reduced anxiety, occasional transcendent experiences, could reflect improved interface with the universal consciousness field. The implications extend beyond individual consciousness. If all conscious beings are coupled to the same ether field, then we are fundamentally interconnected at a level deeper than social or ecological connection. The mystics were right. Separation is illusion. At the deepest level, we are waves in a single ocean, patterns in a unified field. This is not to say individual consciousness is illusory. Rather, individuality and unity are complementary aspects of a more complete reality. Each brain creates a unique pattern of ether field resonance, a distinct melody in the cosmic symphony. Yet all melodies arise from and return to the same fundamental medium. The scientific investigation of consciousness, from this perspective, becomes the study of how neural dynamics couple to ether field dynamics. It requires new instruments capable of detecting longitudinal electromagnetic waves and ether field distortions. It requires new theoretical frameworks that integrate neuroscience, field physics, and perhaps even quantum mechanics. It requires, above all, a willingness to take seriously phenomena that have been dismissed as impossible because they don't fit the current paradigm. We stand at a threshold. The tools to investigate ether consciousness coupling are within reach. The theoretical frameworks are emerging. What's needed is the courage to pursue this research despite institutional skepticism, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The bridge between worlds, between matter and mind, between physics and consciousness, between the material and the transcendent, may be the ether itself. The ether economy. Let us now engage in speculation, rigorous, grounded speculation, but speculation nonetheless. If ether physics is real, if the primordial field can be understood and manipulated, what might human civilization look like a century from now? Scenario 1. The Energy Revolution 2075. Dr. Sarah Chen stands in the control room of the Beijing Ether Resonance Station, watching holographic displays that show the field dynamics across Eastern Asia. The station, one of 300 worldwide, doesn't generate energy in the conventional sense. It extracts it. The ether, as Tesla intuited, is not empty but filled with zero-point energy quantum fluctuations that permeate all of space. The resonance station creates a coherent oscillation in the local ether field, effectively downconverting high-frequency quantum fluctuations into usable electrical current. The process is elegant. No fuel consumed, no waste produced, no emissions. Just pure energy drawn from the fabric of space itself. The station powers 50 million homes. Similar stations power industry, transportation, agriculture. The global energy crisis that dominated the early 21st century is a historical curiosity. Energy is effectively free, limited only by the capacity of transmission infrastructure. But the transformation goes deeper than economics. Abundant energy has reshaped civilization. Desalination plants powered by ether stations provide unlimited fresh water, Vertical farms in climate-controlled towers feed billions. Carbon capture facilities have reversed atmospheric CO2 to pre-industrial levels. Poverty in the material sense has been largely eliminated. Dr. Chen's work focuses on optimization, fine-tuning the resonance frequencies to maximize extraction efficiency while minimizing field distortions. Because there is a cost, ether pollution. Excessive extraction creates dead zones where the field becomes depleted, affecting everything from weather patterns to biological health. The challenge of the 2070s is not generating energy, but managing the ether commons, ensuring that humanity's extraction doesn't damage the fundamental field that sustains reality itself. Scenario 2, the Consciousness Interface 2082. Marcus Rodriguez lies in a neural interface chair at the Consciousness Research Institute in Sao Paulo. Electrodes map his brain activity with submillimeter precision, but the real interface is not electrical, it's etheric. The chair generates precisely tuned longitudinal electromagnetic waves that couple with Marcus's neural field, enhancing the natural ether resonance of his consciousness. As the system activates, his awareness expands. He feels the presence of other minds, not as thoughts or words, but as patterns of resonance, melodies in the field. He's participating in a collective problem-solving session. 50 researchers across 3 continents, their consciousnesses linked through ether field coupling, working on the unified field equations that will finally integrate quantum mechanics, relativity, and ether dynamics into a single theoretical framework. The collaboration is not like a video conference or even a shared virtual reality. It's direct mind-to-mind communication, mediated by the ether field. Ideas flow between participants as fluidly as thoughts flow within a single mind. Marcus contributes an insight about field topology. It's immediately grasped and extended by a mathematician in Mumbai, whose elaboration sparks a recognition in a physicist in Stockholm. The collective intelligence of the group far exceeds the sum of individual capabilities. After 2 hours, the session ends. Marcus returns to individual consciousness, but he carries with him not just memories of the collaboration but actual cognitive enhancements. The ether coupling has created new neural pathways, strengthened existing connections. He's literally smarter than he was before the session. This is the promise and peril of ether-based consciousness technology. It enables unprecedented collaboration, learning, and cognitive enhancement. But it also raises profound questions about identity, privacy, and autonomy. If minds can merge through ether coupling, where does one person end and another begin? The ethics and governance of consciousness technology dominate political discourse in the 2080s. Scenario 3, the Faster-Than-Light Network 2089. The Starship Magellan orbits Proxima Centauri b, 4 light-years from Earth. Commander Sierra Tanaka reviews the day's observations of the potentially habitable exoplanet below. Then she opens a communication channel to Mission Control in Houston. Houston, this is Magellan. We've completed the orbital survey, transmitting full data package now. The response comes instantly. Magellan, Houston, we copy, data received. Analysis team is reviewing, stand by for updated mission parameters. Instantly, not 8 years round trip, as light-speed communication would require. Not even the 8 minutes it takes light to travel from the sun to Earth. Instantly. The communication travels through the ether itself, using longitudinal wave modulation. These waves, being compression waves in the medium rather than transverse oscillations, propagate through the ether at speeds that make light seem sluggish. The exact mechanism is still debated. Some physicists argue the waves travel faster than light, others that they take shortcuts through higher-dimensional ether topology, but the practical result is clear: real-time communication across interstellar distances. This capability has transformed space exploration. Missions to the outer solar system and beyond are no longer one-way journeys into isolation. Astronauts remain in constant contact with Earth. Problems can be solved collaboratively. Discoveries can be shared immediately. Humanity's expansion into the cosmos proceeds not as isolated outposts, but as an integrated civilization spanning multiple star systems. The Magellan itself is powered by an ether drive, a propulsion system that creates controlled distortions in the ether field, effectively falling through space along artificially created gradients. The ship reached Proxima Centauri in 3 years, not the tens of thousands of years that conventional rockets would require. Commander Tanaka looks at the blue-green world below and thinks about the colony ships that will follow. Humanity is becoming a multi-planet, then a multi-star species. And it's all possible because we rediscovered what the ancients knew. Reality is not empty space and isolated particles, but a unified field, a primordial medium that connects all things. These scenarios are speculative, yes, but they're grounded in the logical implications of ether physics. If the field exists and can be manipulated, these technologies follow. The question is not whether they're possible, but whether we'll develop them, whether we'll overcome the institutional inertia that has kept ether physics marginalized for more than a century. The ether economy would be fundamentally different from our current economy. Scarcity-based economics assumes limited resources and competition for access. But if energy is abundant, if communication is instantaneous, if consciousness itself can be enhanced and shared, then the basis of economic organization shifts from competition to coordination, from scarcity to abundance, from isolation to connection. This is not utopian fantasy. Abundant energy doesn't eliminate all problems, it creates new ones, like ether pollution and the governance of consciousness technology. But it does eliminate the artificial scarcity that has driven so much human conflict. It creates the material conditions for a genuinely cooperative civilization. The path from here to there is not obvious. It requires not just technological development, but paradigm shift, a willingness to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. It requires institutional courage to pursue research that challenges established theory. It requires, perhaps most of all, a recovery of the ancient wisdom that saw reality as unified, connected whole. Science and spirit reconciled. I hope to be back in my laboratory soon, decades after that initial intuition. The instruments now are more sophisticated, the theoretical framework more developed, but the fundamental question remains: what is the ether really? The answer I've come to believe is that the ether is the primordial reality, the substrate from which all phenomena emerge. It's not separate from spacetime, but prior to it, more fundamental. Spacetime itself may be an emergent property of ether dynamics, like waves emerging from the ocean. This view reconciles ancient wisdom with modern physics in unexpected ways. The Greeks were right. There is a quintessence, a fifth element beyond the material four. The mystics were right. All things are connected through a universal medium. Tesla was right. This medium can be understood scientifically and harnessed technologically. But Einstein wasn't wrong either. Relativity accurately describes the geometry of spacetime and the behavior of matter and energy within it. Quantum mechanics correctly predicts the probabilistic behavior of particles and fields. These theories work because they're describing real aspects of reality. They're just not describing the deepest level. The ether is that deepest level. It's the field from which quantum fields emerge, the medium in which spacetime is embedded, the substrate that carries consciousness. Understanding it requires integrating insights from physics, neuroscience, philosophy, and yes, even ancient metaphysics. This integration is already beginning. Quantum field theory describes the vacuum not as empty, but as filled with virtual particles and zero-point energy, a description remarkably similar to the ether concept. Theories of quantum consciousness propose that awareness arises from quantum processes in neural microtubules, processes that might couple to a universal field. Even general relativity, with its description of spacetime as a dynamic, curved manifold, hints at an underlying medium that can be distorted and shaped. What's needed is a unified framework that brings these insights together. Call it ether field theory, or neo-ether physics, or quantum medium dynamics, the name matters less than the conceptual shift. We need to stop thinking of space as empty and start thinking of it as full of a primordial field that is the source and sustainer of all existence. The practical implications are profound. If we can understand and manipulate the ether, we gain access to technologies that seem like magic: abundant energy, faster-than-light communication, consciousness enhancement, gravity control. But more than that, we gain a deeper understanding of our place in the cosmos. We are not isolated beings in a dead universe. We are patterns in a living field, waves in a cosmic ocean, notes in an infinite symphony. Our consciousness is not trapped in our skulls, but extends through the ether, connecting us to all other conscious beings and ultimately to the source of consciousness itself. This understanding bridges science and spirituality in a way that honors both. It's not about abandoning scientific rigor for mystical vagueness. It's about expanding science to encompass phenomena that have been dismissed because they didn't fit the materialist paradigm. It's about recognizing that the universe is stranger, more wonderful, and more unified than we imagined. I hope my investigation continues. I dream that I will be working on improved methods for detecting and characterizing longitudinal electromagnetic waves, developing theoretical models of ether field dynamics, and collaborating with neuroscientists on consciousness field coupling experiments. The work will be slow, often frustrating, but I know it will be occasionally exhilarating. I also hope I'm no longer alone. I believe there will be a new generation of researchers, unencumbered by the dogmas of the 20th century, taking up these questions. Papers will be published, experiments conducted, theories refined. The ether will be rediscovered, not as a relic of discarded physics, but as a frontier of new understanding. I think often of Tesla, working alone in his laboratory, pursuing a vision that the scientific establishment had rejected. He died believing he had failed, but perhaps he was simply ahead of his time. Perhaps the 21st century will finally realize the dream he pursued, a science that recognizes the fundamental unity of all things, a technology that harnesses the primordial field, a civilization that lives in harmony with the ether that sustains it. The journey from that moment of intuition in my laboratory to this present moment has been long and often difficult, but it has also been deeply rewarding. I've glimpsed, however imperfectly, the underlying unity of reality. I've seen how ancient wisdom and modern science can inform each other. I've imagined futures where humanity has transcended the limitations of our current understanding and technology. Whether those futures will be realized, I cannot say. But I know this: the ether is real. The primordial field exists, and understanding it may be the key to humanity's next great leap forward, not just technologically but spiritually, not just in our mastery of nature but in our understanding of ourselves. I pray the investigation continues, the ether awaits, and the future, as always, remains to be written. J.B.S. Haldane once said, "The universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose." Perhaps he was correct, but perhaps, too, the ancients understood more than we have given them credit for. Perhaps the ether they intuited, the universal medium they postulated, the primordial field they revered, perhaps it was there all along, waiting for us to remember what we once knew.